This episode is a follow-on from episode 71, where I talked about boundaries of the enterprise. And there were a number of questions that came up, particularly from Michael Poulin. One of them was, does the organisation become the enterprise? At what point does the organisation become the enterprise? And the short answer is, it doesn't. It can't. They're fundamentally different things. What I'm describing as the organisation is a structure that's centred around rules, roles, responsibilities, possession, those kind of ownership, those kind of areas. Whereas an enterprise is essentially a story. It's bounded by vision, values, commitments, a way of describing things. It's a why as opposed to the organisation's how. So they're fundamentally different. They actually can't become something else. Another one was about, is this about control or about influence? What's the difference? The organisation seems to be about control, the enterprise seems to be about influence. Well, it's sort of, except that a fundamental question here is that control is actually a kind of myth. We hope that it exists. The organisation is mostly about an attempt to control, particularly of things that are inside itself. So things that are inside its boundary of control, as opposed to its boundary of identity, which is not necessarily the same, particularly when we're outsourcing. So there are some really important things to explore around this distinction between control versus influence. We certainly can't control things that are outside the organisation, but we need to understand them in order to make them work. Another one was about merger and acquisition. Does this shrink the enterprise? Well, no, not really. It's quite different. You're talking about expanding the organisation, which does not take over the enterprise, because the enterprise is a story. It's not something that can be controlled, that can be owned, it can be possessed. It can't. It doesn't work that way. What a merger acquisition does is it takes a larger slice of the market, perhaps all the way up to a monopoly, where they can, to some extent, control the market itself. But it still doesn't control the story. So it still doesn't override the idea of enterprise as story. And a final one was about, if we're saying the enterprise is a story and is larger than, or we need to look larger than the organisation, doesn't this imply that enterprise extends to infinity? Well, the short answer is yes, it does. Every enterprise is an enterprise of stories, a story of story, an enterprise of enterprises, all intersecting all the way up to the scope of a planet and possibly beyond. But that's not practical. The reason why we talk about enterprise is because we're looking at something that is larger in scope than the organisation itself. Typically we're talking about 3 layers out. The organisation itself and the things it can control, the transaction space, which is suppliers, customers and so on, the direct interaction space, which is about market, is about regulators, those kind of areas. And finally, there's another indirect interactions, which are about how the organisation intersects with the broader story, things like government, community, anti-clients. So that's about as far as we need to go. In principle, we might need to go beyond, because there might well be hidden assumptions that we haven't addressed. But what we're doing is we take it out to those 3 levels, because that'll get most of the important assumptions that we need to address.